Good morning for Queensland time, good afternoon, just afternoon for New South. Welcome to Border Church in the Park. It's such a nice day, such a beautiful weather. Today we are looking at our continued series on prayers of power, prayers and pray-ers of power, unlocking omnipotence. Today we've been making our way through the book of Genesis, the history in Genesis, and God's communication with humanity and our communication back. We've looked at the people before the flood. We've looked at Noah. We've looked at Abraham, Jacob, and now we're on Joseph today. We're looking at Joseph, and Joseph is an example of perseverance in prayer. Perseverance in prayer, as we will see. And we're actually going to be doing a bit of a theme on that, because next week and the week after we're going to look at Job, because chronologically Job is around the time of the patriarchs. So Job is a fascinating study. We're going to look next week at Job and his anguish prayers, and then the week after we'll look at God's answer, because God answers. God shows up in Job, and God showed up in Joseph and his story as well. And God always shows up at the time that he's ready to show up. Okay? And that's one of the themes we're going to be looking at today. So, let's have a look at the story of Joseph. Now, before we get there, there's a few prayers that I want to touch on, because it kind of leads into this. So it's in Genesis. We're in Genesis today. And what I didn't touch on last week was that in the life of Jacob, his wives also prayed. His wives also prayed, and we see that specifically. So this is Leah and Rachel. They prayed at the birth of each son. Now, it doesn't come across as saying they prayed. We don't see the word prayer in there. But at the birth of their sons, they declare something. They out of their heart, they say something over their children, and their name is derived from that. So, for example, Rachel actually dies when she's giving birth to her second child, and that second child is Benjamin. But she's actually in such sorrow, like childbirth. Mortality in childbirth was very big in ancient world because of hygiene reasons and other stuff. We've managed to nip a lot of that in the bud in terms of modern times, but she is obviously in a lot of pain. She's dying, and so she declares over him, "Son of my sorrow, this is my son of my sorrow." And that name is Benoni, so she gives him the name Benoni. But remember, her husband Jacob steps in and changes the name to Benjamin. So instead of Benoni, he becomes Benjamin, and Benjamin means son of my right hand. So the father steps in and says, no, that's not his identity. He's not going to forever be known as the son of sorrow. He's going to be known as the son of my right hand. And it's actually a bit of a twist there on Jesus, who was the son of sorrow, but then became the son of God's right hand. He was the son of God's sorrow, and God then changed that identity to son of his right hand. So each one of those names, if you have a look at, like, for example, Judah, Yehuda means I will praise Yahweh. So that's the name of Leah's fourth child was Yehuda, and so that means son of my... that means praise of Yahweh. Yehuda is praise of Yahweh. And so you see this in the prayers of the wives of... and then, of course, they would even declare the name over their servants' children, because they offered their handmaidens to Jacob to have even more children. That started off with Rachel, who was barren. She gave her handmaiden to Jacob, and Jacob didn't do a lot of complaining at this dirty old man. But, that was the culture back then. So she was trying to get children through that because of that sense of ownership. So we're going to look at the story of Joseph here, and Joseph is one of my favorite stories in Scripture. It's such a good one, and I posted on Facebook last night that I was tempted to prepare for the sermon in a cheat way by watching Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, just because I love the songs in that. Once you see Pharaoh as Elvis, you can't see him any other way. And so Lorraine, if you need some water. Yeah, get some water, Alina. Yep. So yeah, so I was tempted to look at it through that. So, and the other one is, of course, has anyone seen Prince of Egypt? The Prince of Egypt, it was that Disney one about the Exodus, Moses and the Exodus. Disney animated one. Well, they did one on Joseph called Joseph, King of Dreams. It was a directed-to-video one. Maybe the long one here, the bigger one. Okay. Yeah, make sure you stay hydrated outside, especially in the breeze. So the story of Joseph is he has these dreams. He has these dreams, and God really reveals stuff to him. So he obviously has, and he's the favorite son of his father Jacob. He's the first son of Jacob's favorite wife, which is Rachel. Rachel finally has a kid, and it's Joseph. And so he becomes the prized kid. And so I'm going to have a look at a bit of the stories here. So in chapter 37 of Genesis, Joseph has a couple of dreams. The first dream that he has is he dreams about he's being bowed down to by the sun, the moon, and the stars. They're bowing down to him. And 12 stars. 12. Does it say 12? It says 11 stars. So he has 11 brothers. So he's the sun and the moon and 11 stars are bowing down to him. And Jacob even, the first dream was of sheaves. But the second dream, and so it was these sheaves that were bowing down to him. This one, so the sheaves were bundles of grain that were bowing down to him. The second one was more pronounced. It was the sun, the moon, and 11 stars. And so Jacob and everyone was understanding that this was, a prophecy that Jacob and his wives and all of the brothers were going to bow down to this younger son. Okay, this younger son, they were going to bow down to him. And they were like, well, what is this? This is very much a lot of pride from you. And so the brothers were jealous because he's already been, made the favorite. He's been given this beautiful coat. And so the brothers are jealous, and even the father is like, what are you doing? Are you just trying to... And you got to wonder whether there's a little bit of pride in Joseph's mind, like declaring these things so publicly. Sometimes what God gives you is for you alone. Has anyone been given a word from God that is really for you alone? You don't always have to share it with someone. If someone tells you a secret, is it right to go and share it with everyone? Sometimes God gives you a secret.
People get excited.
You can get excited, but just wisdom can come into it. But maybe the story would be very different if he hadn't, got them so jealous. Now here's the thing. I was reading this, and it's just something that I want to put to you. So let's pick up in verse 12 of chapter 37. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. Now Shechem was the place where they'd just slaughtered all of these people because their sister had been violated near there. So they go to this area and they're pasturing their flock. And Israel, this is Jacob's new name, Israel says to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock near Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So Jacob says to Joseph, who's obviously, he's protected from the hard labor of going out into the field. He's at home, and you can kind of see this is the favorite sheltered son. And so go out and tell me how the boys are doing, how your brothers are doing. Now remember, all of his brothers that are going to be out in the flock, with the flocks, none of them they're all his half-brothers. None of them are actually from his mum. Benjamin's younger than Joseph, so he's not out there. And so Joseph is going out there to his half-brothers. They're not even his full brothers. They're, same dad, different mums, right? So that's where he goes out. And they're all jealous. They're all madly jealous. This is a kid who thinks that they're all going to bow to him, that God's told him that they're all going to be bowing to him one day. that gets special coloured clothes, that gets to stay home while they're out slaving in the field. And so he goes out there, and it says, "And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, 'What are you seeking?' And Joseph said to this man, 'I am seeking my brothers. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock.' And the man said, 'They've gone away, for I heard them say, let's go to Dothan.' So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan." This is in Genesis 37. And I was reading this last night, and I'm like, who is this man? Who is this random man? So Genesis 37, this man, and I was wondering, could this man perhaps be God? Could this man perhaps be Jesus? Sometimes Jesus appears as a man in the book of Genesis. Okay, when Abraham entertained three men, it says men. It's the same word for man. When he entertained three men, one of them was Jesus. The other two were angels. Okay, that was Jesus and two angels, because the two angels went on to Sodom, and the man said, started speaking as a divine person, saying, "Shall I withhold from Abraham what I've done?" We looked at that last couple of weeks ago. So that's a man. There was another man that Jacob wrestled. Remember? Jacob wrestled a man. And I wonder whether this is the same man that Jacob had wrestled, because it says a man. It's this random detail in a man. And I wonder now, this telling Joseph where to go is a crucial part of everything that then follows. Had Joseph not found his brothers, everything that we're going to read in the book of Genesis doesn't happen. And I wonder now God is a guiding individual in the book of Genesis. God is like nudging things. He's pointing people in the right way to go. And so that's what we see here in the book of Genesis. So this man, God was speaking to me saying, focus on this man. And I wonder whether this man was Jesus. Good to see you. So we're just looking at Joseph, at the story of Joseph. So we see that he goes, and what happens with Joseph at the end of this? He goes and he finds his brothers. His brothers conspire. They see him coming, and they're like, "Let's get him. Let's kill him." They actually say, "Let's kill him. He's not our full brother. He's our father's favorite. Maybe father will pay attention to us if we murderize him." So they say, "Let's kill him, throw him in a pit, and we'll say that a wild animal killed him." And some of the brothers are not fully in with this plan. Okay, do you remember? There was Reuben. Reuben had one idea. Reuben was saying, "Well, I'm just going to if they can hold off, I'll come back and rescue him later. If they don't kill him, we'll put him in a pit." And so he says, "Let's just put him in a pit, and we won't kill him. Well, let's not have his blood on our hands." Reuben was planning to come back, rescue him, take him to his father. Also, I wonder, because Reuben was the oldest son altogether. He was the oldest of Leah's kids. And he's maybe thinking, I'll show Dad that I'm the best. I'll show Dad that I'm the absolute best here by doing the right thing, and then I'll be the favorite again. You could see that. I'll let all the other brothers take the blame for this. They'll take the fall. And so you can, that's how I kind of imagine it going. I came from a family that's not as big as this family, but I was the oldest of 5, and I could totally see that as being a motive. And so he goes away, hoping for some reason, and while he's away planning to come back and sneak and rescue him, Judah has a different idea. He's like, "Let's not kill him, let's sell him. Let's at least get some money out of this." So these Ishmaelites are coming along, and so they're relatives. Ishmael is Abraham's other son, one of his other sons. And so they're like, "Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites." So they sell him into bondage to the Ishmaelites, who then take him to Egypt. So Joseph has, and then the brothers go back and say that we found his cloak and there's all this blood, maybe he's been killed. So that's how they break their father's heart, basically. But they haven't killed him. So God protected the God who probably directed, that's in my mind now, my headcanon, this man that Joseph had met, who told him where his brothers were. I think that was Jesus. And Jesus then protected him from harm, but he needed to go through this. Possibly for some of the pride that Joseph had. Who's been a favourite child? Who's known a sibling who's a favourite child? You know? And they kind of, you know, they could do with some hardship, couldn't they? And God knew that in Joseph's case. So Joseph goes, and God's got a plan for Joseph. God's going to fulfill that dream that he gave Joseph at the very beginning. Who feels like God's given them a calling, but then you don't feel like it's coming to pass? You know? Sometimes the calling comes well before the potential to fulfill that calling. God tells you this is where you're going to end up, but he doesn't tell you how you're going to get there sometimes. And so he goes to Egypt, and he's sold in Egypt into the household of Potiphar. Potiphar was one of the royal guards, captain of the royal guards of Pharaoh in Egypt. And he's sold into this house. And it says here, let's go to Genesis 39, and we're going to just look at some spotlights of the story of Joseph. So it says in 39, now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And it says, and Yahweh was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. So God was with him in slavery. God, who directed him to the place where he would be betrayed, stayed with him. God was with him in slavery to the point where he blessed him, and he was able to be he was basically second in charge of everything in the household. In fact, he goes on to tell the wife of Potiphar, my master withholds nothing from me except you. I can have anything in this place because I'm second here. Because the wife tries to seduce Joseph. And Joseph remains faithful and says no. And eventually she frames him for assaulting her, and he gets thrown into prison. Okay, so he gets thrown into prison, and then it says, we come down later in the chapter, now he's in prison, and we see the exact same words, verse 21. But so we'll just pick up from verse 19. And as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, basically saying that this is the way your servant treated me, saying that she was assaulted by Joseph when she wasn't, his anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him, put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. But the very same words are here. But Yahweh, the Lord, was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. The keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because Yahweh was with him. And whatever he did, Yahweh made him succeed. So isn't that amazing that the same words, when Joseph is in slavery, Yahweh is with him. Makes him prosper in slavery. When Joseph is in prison now, Yahweh is with him in the prison. Makes him prosper. Okay, now, in the next chapter, Joseph meets these two people. There's a baker, and there is a cupbearer for Pharaoh. And so a baker was the person who was in charge of baking the king's goods, and the cupbearer was the person who had to taste the Pharaoh's wine to make sure it wasn't poison. It's not a great job, because if someone wants to poison Pharaoh, you're first. Okay? And these two people get put in prison. Maybe, in my mind, maybe they got into a bit of an argument during some sort of a banquet and made the king embarrassed, and he threw him in prison for a few days to cool off while he decided what to do with them. And kings back then, they were no different to rulers these days. They were very fickle, and so, the king could decide to off with your head, or he could decide, I'll restore you to favour. And so these two people have dreams. So they both have a dream on the same night. And they were troubled by their dreams. And Joseph comes along and he says, why are your faces downcast? They said to him, we've had dreams and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Now Joseph has skill with dreams, but he gives the credit to God. Joseph is very similar to Daniel, Remember when Daniel interprets the dream, and not only interprets, but he gets given the same dream, because the Nebuchadnezzar didn't know what the dream was. He gives the credit to God. He could have taken the credit himself, but he gives the credit to God. We see that here with these two guys. And so one of them, the cupbearer, had a dream, and there was a vine, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, the blossoms shot forth. The clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph said, in 3 days, you're going to be put back into your same office. You're going back to the king's court, and you're going to be cupbearer again. And so he's like extremely happy with this interpretation. And Joseph says, please, when you're restored, remember this, do this kindness to me. Remember me and tell Pharaoh about me. And then the chief baker is like, well, he got good news. I'll tell him my dream. I'll get some good news. Unfortunately, it's not the same. He has 3 baskets, cake baskets on his head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked foods for Pharaoh, but birds were eating out of the basket on my head. Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. So he doesn't get a very good outcome. And in 3 days, these 2 things are fulfilled. The cupbearer is restored, the baker is killed. But the cupbearer is so happy to be restored that he forgets about Joseph and doesn't say anything. Okay? Now, 2 years later, come to chapter 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing... So Pharaoh now has a dream, and he sees 2 things. He sees 7 healthy cows and then 7 ugly thin cows coming up out of the Nile. And then the ugly thin cows ate the big fat cows. And then he sees another dream, and he sees 7 ears of grain that are really, really good looking. And then he sees 7 thin ears, really withered ears, and they swallow up the 7 healthy ears. And so Pharaoh's had these 2 dreams, and he's like confused. He doesn't know what they are. He's telling all of his wise men. None of them have the answer for him. And all of a sudden the cupbearer's like, oh, I remember a guy who was in prison who told me my dream. So they shave Joseph, they put new clothes on him, they bath him, so that you can't just come from prison to meet the Pharaoh. Okay? You have to have new clothes. And so he's been in prison for at least 2 years at this stage, probably longer. Now, he was 17 at the time we meet Joseph in the story. He was 17 when he's getting the golden cloak, and we know that by this stage he's 30. Okay, we're going to find that out in a minute, because he's 30 when he enters into Pharaoh's service. So he has spent some years in Potiphar's house and some years in prison, at least 2. But I'd say it's probably longer. So he spent a good period of time of between age 17 and age 30 as a slave and a prisoner. But God has prospered him in that time. Now, can you imagine Joseph praying in prison? God was with him. That means that they were having conversations. What do you think Joseph was? What sort of things do you think Joseph was saying to God in prison? Before this time, before Pharaoh comes and gets him. Well, no. What do you think Joseph's saying to God? Why am I here? Didn't you give me a dream that I was going to be something? Has anyone felt like God's called them to be something? Every one of you has been called to be something. He called to do something. Called to a high calling. The Bible calls it. We're called to a high calling. Does your life sometimes feel like it's very different to the calling that you've been given? Look at Joseph. He was called to be something, and God had a plan for him. But most of the time that we read of the story of Joseph up to this point, he's either a slave, and yeah, you might be the best slave there is, the highest slave, but you're still a slave. You might be the highest of the prisoners, but you're still a prisoner. And Joseph must be thinking, is this all there is, God? Is all that I'm supposed to do is to tell people in prison about you? Yes, you're supposed to do that, but maybe that's not all. Maybe there's more. Is all I'm supposed to do is to run this as an example of you, run Potiphar's household? Yes, but maybe there's more. And so you can imagine the prayers and who's prayed for something for a long time? Who's prayed for the same thing for a long time? Yeah? Who is still praying for something they haven't got yet for a long time? Okay? Maybe 12 years he's praying in slavery and prison. This Joseph is praying for something. Keep praying. Don't stop. God's timetable is different to ours, but it's going to happen. If God's called something for you into your life, He's going to fulfill it. And sometimes it might take a roundabout way. Maybe we fumble the ball. Look at Moses. We're going to be talking about him in about a month. Moses was called to be deliverer of Israel from his birth. He was called to be deliverer from birth. How old was Moses when he finally delivered Israel from Egypt? 80. At 40 years old, he makes a massive mistake and murders someone, and that costs another 40 years on top of it where he's out tending sheep. God might have called you. I know that God put a calling on my life very early, and I got so frustrated for years not being able to do anything. And, then all of a sudden it comes, and you're like, oh my goodness, I don't know if I was ready for this. Keep praying. Keep feeding off of God, because God is preparing you. He's waiting for the right time. Joseph, he had a great calling, and we're going to see that in a moment. But he had to keep praying and go, God, what? And you can imagine he's taking that to God. God, why am I here? Why? What are you putting me through? As bad as Disney is, if you ever watch the movie King of Dreams, Joseph, King of Dreams, it's the story, it's the Disney version of the story of Joseph. And there's a beautiful song where he's in the prison tending this little plant, and I really recommend watching that. God can even use Disney to tell a story, and it's really well done. It's during the golden age of Disney when they had Prince of Egypt and they had Little Mermaid and all those sort of things. Sorry? And Principles. Yes, it's pre-woke Disney, and so. Not that Disney was always ever perfect, but it was better. And these days, if they did it, Joseph would have to be trans, something like that.
They always tell in New Zealand.
Yeah. So anyway, with this story, the key that was coming to me as I was looking at it, God sometimes calls you and then calls you into hardship before he knows you're ready for the kingdom work that he has to do. Okay, so that's what I'm seeing here. Now, Pharaoh brings him out. He comes before Pharaoh. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of abundance, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine. So much so that you'll forget about the years of plenty. They're going to swallow up all of the abundance that you had. And then he goes even further and he says, Pharaoh, here's what you should do. You've been given an insight by God. God is speaking to you, Pharaoh. God speaks to even the pagans. Okay? That's prayer is two ways. And God is speaking to Pharaoh here in this story. And sometimes we as Christians need to be ready to interpret what God is speaking to people. Okay? And so God is speaking and saying, this is what I'm preparing you for something, Pharaoh. God wasn't just preparing Joseph, he was preparing Pharaoh for something. And so he says, you can now come and use these 7 years of abundance, take 1/5 of all of the grain, all of the produce that you make in these 7 years of abundance, and put it aside for the years of drought, for the years of famine, because you're going to need that. And it's amazing that Pharaoh follows this advice, and he's able to basically absorb all of the land in Egypt. He's able to absorb all of the cattle. Pharaoh becomes very rich over this period, because then he sells that grain back to the people. And in history, this is a particular time in history. If you look at the work of Patrick Clark wrote a couple of articles on this for Creation, Journal of Creation, for Creation Ministries International. And there's a particular time where Egypt had been divided, but then it became whole again. And this is the time where he believes that Joseph was the advisor for Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh was able to absorb, without warfare, he was able to reunify Egypt through economic means. And that's what we see here. So, history bears up with this particular period of what's going on. And so Joseph, Pharaoh says this to him. He takes his signet ring, puts it on Joseph's hand, clothes him in garments of fine linen, puts a gold chain on his neck, made him ride in his second chariot, and he changes his name to Zaphnath-Paneah, which means the one in whom is the wisdom of the gods, or God, and is the wisdom of God, because God's Elohim, if they're using that, it could be God. And so this is the one in whom is the wisdom of God. And he even gives him the daughter of one of the priests to marry. So Joseph now is head over all the land of Egypt. Joseph becomes a savior figure because he steps in to famine and makes it so that there was food during the famine. He's a type of Jesus. Is Jesus not the right hand of God? Isn't Jesus the right hand of the Father? Isn't he the one in whom is the wisdom? He's called wisdom. One of Jesus' titles is wisdom. Isn't he clothed in fine garment? Aren't people to bow to Jesus just as they bow to the Father? Joseph is a type of Jesus in this. So not only is he going to save Egypt and the lands beyond in Canaan, but he is now going to be a type of Jesus. Didn't Jesus have to go into prison before he could go to the right hand of God? What prison did Jesus have to go into? He had to become a slave. He had to become a servant. That's a cool... isn't that the theme song from Columbo? Or from Perry Mason or something? It reminds me of Perry Mason or Columbo or one of those. No. Anyway, it's... sorry, I got distracted. Carolyn. Yeah, and... So, so he becomes a figure of Jesus. We can all become types of Jesus when we fulfill our calling. You know that there's a lot of people who will not enter a church today. There are a lot of people who will not enter a church, which is why we come to the park sometimes. But you might be the only church they enter into. Your home might be the only church they enter into. You might be the only Jesus they ever meet. Who has met people who hate Jesus? I've met people who hate Jesus. They don't hate my Jesus. They hate a different Jesus, a false Jesus that's been represented to them. I've never met a person who hates my Jesus. They hate a different Jesus, a cruel Jesus that people have made people think that is cruel. You know what I mean? So you might be the only Jesus someone meets. God has called all of us to be a representative of Jesus, to be a type of Jesus, to be his hands and feet and eyes and ears in this world. And so sometimes we have to go through prison to get there. We see a bit more prayer as we look through here. Now Joseph, again, when the Pharaoh calls him, he says, "Can you answer this?" And I forgot to mention this in verse 16 of 41. Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It's not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." God is going to give the answer. If we declare that and give glory to God, God's speaking to us all the time, isn't he? Through the word. Now we could pretend that this is us. We could let it go to our heads, but no, we're just messengers. We've got to give glory to whoever's giving the message all the time. So we can do that. Okay, now I love the story of Joseph after that. It's very, very human. It's very, very raw. Joseph has to learn what forgiveness really is. He has his brothers come up because the famine, after the 7 years of plenty, so, Joseph is now 37 at least. If he's 30 when he becomes the advisor to Pharaoh, after 7 years of plenty, he's 37. And that's 20 years after his brothers sold him into slavery. 20 years have gone past. He's unrecognizable. He's unrecognizable. Sometimes I've met people from 20 years ago and they recognize me. Most of the time they don't. You change a lot. I didn't have a beard back then, so... but this is the thing, 20 years have passed. 20 years of... Who's held on to grief and bitterness? Who's held on to something? What does it do to you? Now, he's had a relationship with God, but he's also had pain. We all hold on to pain. And in that time, God has been preparing him not only to save Egypt, but to forgive his brothers. Okay? What do you think he's been doing to help him get to that place where he could forgive his brothers? He's been a servant. He's become a servant. When he was with his father, he was basically a privileged kid. He was a kid of privilege. Now he's had to work hard. Do you think that as being head over servants and other prisoners, he's had to forgive other people? He's had to see forgiveness play out? Do you think that he's seen God work in his life in miraculous ways and had to forgive him? Now, we don't see him committing sin, but we know he was a sinner. The story doesn't tell us any sins. He's one of those, that's another way he's a type of Jesus, because it doesn't explicitly say. But he's had pride that he's had to work through. He's had to work through all of these things. And in prison, that prepared him to be able to, and also in overseeing these 7 years of plenty, he's been prepared to forgive his brothers. So his brothers come, and they want food, because the famine has reached as far away as Canaan, Israel. So it's not just in Egypt, it's everywhere. And everyone's coming, so he's able to influence the whole world. Okay, he's able to be savior of the whole world through this famine, just like Jesus, another way that he's a type of Jesus. And the brothers come to get grain from Egypt, because they heard that the only place you can get food is in Egypt right now. So they come to Egypt, and he recognizes them straight away. They haven't changed. Like, he doesn't even look like a Hebrew anymore. He'd be looking like an Egyptian, and so, with the shaved head and all the whatever they've done, walking like an Egyptian, so they don't recognize him, but he knows straight away who they are. Now, not all of them come; only 10 of them come, because obviously he's not one of them, and they've left the youngest brother at home, Benjamin, who's his actual brother, full brother. They've left him back with Jacob. Now, you can understand Jacob. His favourite wife had 2 children, Joseph, who he thinks is dead, and Benjamin. He's not letting him out of his sight. Okay, under no circumstances. I'm not going to lose my other favourite son. And so Jacob is back home. The brothers come. They buy some grain. Joseph says, if you come back, I think you're spies. They say, no, we're not spies. Prove it to me by bringing your youngest brother next time. And then he puts a bunch of rich things, money in to their sacks, to the point where they're fearful to come back, because they're like, is he going to think that we stole this? Is he going to think that we stole all this stuff? And we can't come back because Dad's never going to let us bring Benjamin with us. And he said, don't even show your face if you don't bring your youngest son. So they go home. They use up all the food. We've eventually got to go back and get some more food. And the dad says, go and get some more food. We can't go without Benjamin. I'm not letting you go. But if you don't let us go, we can't go. Okay, fine, take him. And even, it's interesting, Judah was the one who said, let's sell him into slavery, remember? Judah says, if anything happens to Benjamin, you can take my 2 sons and kill them. You can do what you want with them. Isn't that amazing? They got to the point where they had changed, and Joseph was wanting to see that. He's just wanting to see whether they've changed. So they come back. Joseph frames Benjamin by putting his cup in the sack, so that when they search, they say, hey, you've stolen this cup. You've stolen my favorite cup. I'm going to have to put Benjamin in prison. Now, he's got no intention of this. And what do the brothers do? Take me instead. Take me instead. Don't take him. Let it be me. And Joseph is just like, this is a change. He's thinking, surely they're going to hate Benjamin like they hated me. But they see the difference. These boys were broken from what they'd done. And then I love how it says that he's like, everyone get out. He tells all the Egyptians to get out, and then he starts crying to the point where even Pharaoh can hear him. He just cries bitterly. Like 20 years, probably more than that by now, because it would have been a few years where they've used up the grain, and all this time he has held on to this. Maybe 22, 23, 24 years he has been holding on to this pain. Who's been abandoned and rejected? Has anyone been abandoned and rejected? I mean, I have. If you look at schema therapy, I'm a counsellor, so schema, one of my strongest schemas, my biggest things to work through is rejection. I have been rejected a lot because I don't say the nice things when I speak my mind, so that often gets you rejected. And so, I know what it is to be rejected. Has anyone been rejected by family? Yeah? Yep. Rejected by family is hard. It's extremely hard. Church family. I've been rejected by church family. Sometimes church family can become your new family, and when they reject you, it's even worse. I've been rejected by that. And there's been times where you've had that. Who's been reconciled to family that you've been rejected from? And you just feel like this sense of weight has gone. This burden has gone from you. That's what Joseph is feeling in this massive way. Because I've been, oftentimes we get rejected by family, but not all of our family. He was rejected by all of his brothers at once, in one go. And now he's reconciled to all of his brothers in one go. And he's going to see his dad again. So you can just see this. How much do you think he prayed over this matter? All that time, 20 years. God, why did you do this? Why did they hate me? Why did they, why am I going through this? It's the best. The main question we can ask God sometimes is why. Why was I affected by the flooding? In this, we've had people that we've seen devastated by flooding a year ago. Why have I been, lost my job? Why did I lose family members over, with COVID or with the jabs or whatever? Why? It's it's the letter that we take to God the most is the letter Y. Why? God is going to answer it in His time. Persistence in prayer. Why have you given me this calling and you haven't given me the opportunity to use it? Just wait. God's answering us and saying, I know the times. I'm the one who sets the times. That's one of the things that we see in Daniel, is that God is the one who changes times and seasons. Sometimes it's a season for preparing you. Sometimes it's a season for you to fulfill where God wants you to be. But all the time, you're where God wants you to be. God was with him in Potiphar's house. God was with him in the prison. God was also with him when he was second in charge of all of Egypt. If you're connected to God, God is with you. God is with you in rejection. God is with you in the pain. God is with you in all of those things. That's what I love about this story, is that God never left Joseph. When God said, you need to go into, because basically I reckon that man was Jesus, saying you need to go to your brothers, because he knew what was going to happen. When God knew that he had to go through prison, through slavery in prison, to get to be the wise person who could rule all of Egypt. Okay? Sometimes you've got an amazing calling on your life, but you have to take stages. Moses had to tend sheep before he could tend to Israel. Okay, now sheep are hard to tend to. They can be really hard to. There's this video on that I see all the time on Facebook, where this guy's pulling this sheep out of a ditch. Has anyone seen this one? He pulls, and then the sheep jumps up, bounce back in the ditch, straight back in the ditch. And how often is that for us? Are we like that for God? How often are other people like that we're trying to deal with? Like jump, boom. That's our lives sometimes. Wait, be persistent, be patient. God has got it. And that's the story that we see in Joseph. Now, God speaks to Joseph all the way through that. We don't see the explicit things that God is saying. We don't see the explicit things that Joseph is saying to God. But we can imagine what they are. And the fact that it says that God was with him. Now, God gives a couple of things here just to close off the book of Genesis. We see in Genesis chapter 46, let's go to Genesis 46, we see God speaking again to Jacob this time, Genesis 46. And you can imagine what Jacob has been saying to God for these 20 odd years. Why did you take my favorite boy? Why did you take... There's also a bit of a resurrection motif here, because Joseph, who was lost and dead to Jacob, he's going to get him back. How many people have you lost in your life who you miss? I'm seeing death a lot more now. I don't think it's confirmation bias. I really think I'm seeing more people dying these days. Like every week it's someone else. And as I look at it, Jacob must have been asking God, why have I got this loss? The answer is going to be, you're going to get him back. If we're in Jesus, we will be resurrected. We will meet up together in the clouds one day. And so God speaks to Jacob in Genesis 46, verses 2 to 4. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. And he said to him, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So he's basically said, I've restored to you what you have lost, and you will see, the last thing you see will be your favorite son. Okay, he lives several more years in Egypt, but he also says going into Egypt is not going to be the end of the promise I gave to you. It's the beginning of it. Just like Joseph had to go into Egypt and experience that, so did the rest of Israel, because they came out of there a massive nation. We're going to see that in a few years. We're going to have a break doing Job, but then we're going to look at the next step is when they come out of Egypt. We're looking at the going in. Then Joseph, we see 2 chapters of Jacob praying. Jacob prays for 2 chapters after this. You don't see it as prayer, but he has all of his sons and grandsons come before him, and he speaks blessing over them. When we speak blessing, that's actually prayer. Did you know that? You can be praying by speaking blessing over people, because you're calling on God to fulfill that. And if you look at those chapters, we're not going to read through them, but he's blessing his sons. When you bless people, you're praying that God will do that thing. Do you have the power to bless people? Do you have the power to call blessing on people? No. You don't have that creative power. You're calling on God. You're saying, God, you do this for me. So Jacob, using some prophecy, he's tapping into God's prophecy, but he's praying. He's praying over his sons. In chapter 48, he's praying over the sons of Joseph, adopting them into his family, and then he prays over his biological sons. And then the final bit of prayer that we see in the book of Genesis, the final hint of prayer, is in the very last chapter, chapter 50, verses 19 to 21, where we see, but Joseph said after Jacob dies, his brothers come to Joseph, and they've still got that little bit of a niggle of fear. Maybe now that Dad's gone, Joseph's going to take it out on us. And they say, we're your servants. We're ready to serve you, Joseph. And Joseph says, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them as he spoke kindly to them. Joseph gained an insight that had to have come. He didn't have the Bible. We're reading Genesis here. We're reading a story in Genesis. Genesis is the first of our books. He didn't have Genesis through to Revelation. He didn't have anything. How do you think he got his revelation of God's character? Through communion with God. Through speaking to God and listening to God. That's why I love these stories of Genesis, because you can see prayer even if it doesn't say they prayed. They had to be praying. They could not know God without God showing up. God showed up in the life of Joseph, and he says, you meant evil, but God turned it to good. And isn't that the story of the gospel? We meant evil. Our hearts are evil as we're born. God turned that evil on the cross into good with the empty tomb. He turned that evil, when we killed Jesus, into the empty tomb. I'm actually talking about this on the I'll be recording this for the radio for Juice 107, and I'm like, how do I condense into a minute and a half the gospel? There's so many ways to tell it. Here is one of those ways. Joseph understood who Jesus was going to be, the one who turns evil to good. He takes the evil and he abolishes it and he turns it to good. And then he spoke comfortingly. That is the challenge for us. If we are drawing from God, if we have more blessings than Joseph had. How? We have 66 books of stories. We have Joseph's story plus all the others. How much more comfort can we speak to people? The people who've thought to do evil against us? How can we see that like I was kicked out of a church. And now I've got this church. You know, I was kicked out of a church over COVID. During COVID, over my stance for freedom, people thought evil against me, and God worked it to good. What is it? What prison have you been sent into by God, so that it can prepare you for a calling? What evil has happened to you that God is waiting to turn into good? It's happening. It's waiting. Persist in prayer. When you're in the prison, when you're in the slavery, persist in prayer. The answer is coming. The answer already is. God already sees the answer. God already knew what was necessary. He knew that Joseph had to be in Egypt, so he had to be sold into slavery. That's why I think that man in Genesis 37:15, if that man was not Jesus, I'll eat my hat when we ask God. But I'm pretty sure that had to have been Jesus, because it started the whole ball rolling for the salvation of the world in that day from the famine. Isn't that amazing? So then that would say that the same man that Abraham met is the same man that Jacob wrestled with, and the same man that Joseph encountered. Okay, let's close with prayer and think. As we pray, I want you to just put your mind on the things that you have been praying ages for that you haven't got an answer for yet. Okay, picture those in your mind. God knows your mind. God knows your heart. Picture them, because they're coming. They're coming soon, sooner than you realize. Okay, Father in heaven, we thank you that you are a God over time. Okay, you are a God who, yes, you're in time with us, but you see far, you see all of it. You see everything that's coming. You see all the possibilities, all of the ways that it could turn out, and you are a God who guides. Thank you for being a God who guides us even into places we wouldn't choose ourselves in our limited scope, so that you can prepare us for bigger things. Father, each one of us can think about things we've been praying a long time for. Loved ones that don't know the gospel. You've given us calling. Some of us might not be living the calling that we know you've placed on our hearts right now. It might be still a little bit out of reach. Father, you know when it's coming. You know what is going to come. You know how you're going to shape our lives and guide our lives, just like the men that you know, Jesus, who I believe encountered Joseph and sent him on this path. Father, you are in our life, and you are constantly nudging us in the way that you want us to go. One day we're going to look back, and all of the hardships that we see now, we're going to go, it was worth it, it was cheap enough, heaven was cheap enough, and we're going to say, thank you for sending us through that, so that we could do what you wanted us to do. We see a community that is going through a famine right now in this world. We've had more than 7 years of famine of your word, famine of your spirit, famine of grace, because we have taken our eyes as humans. We've taken our eyes increasingly off you. There's so many distractions. Father, please let us be raised up as overseers of your repository of grain, of food, that when people are hungry, we can say, this is where you can get it. Okay? And all we have to do to get it is to sell ourselves to you, is to give ourselves over to you. Thank you that we are bought by you with that price, and that you are not only our master, but you're our friend. You've elevated us into your household as joint heirs with Jesus, and if Jesus is at your right hand, that makes all of us at your right hand. So Father, as we step into that calling of Joseph, I pray that you will help us to continue to persevere in prayer, that you will reassure us that the answer is to come. Just as you were with Joseph in slavery and in the prison, be with us now in whatever part of our lives that we are in. Be with all of those who haven't been able to make it today, who were scared off by the weather. Forgive them. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much that you gave us such a good day today, and be with the food that we're about to eat. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.